Hello everybody. It's been quite some time since I've sat down and made a video for you all, but there was one scene in the most recent episode of The Bad Batch that I needed to unpack, and there's just no other satisfying way for me to do that. So hello, I'm back on your screens. The episode in question is Season 2, Episode 9. Echo has just parted ways with the squad to help Rex on Coruscant, and now the remaining members of the Marauder crew are left to cope. Omega in particular is very clear about how upset she is, and Tech in particular is having trouble understanding her. There's a scene between them toward the end in which they make an effort to understand each other that was really resonant across the Bad Batch fanbase. It was really important to me to discuss this scene. I think it's an important scene, not just in the world of the show, but to many in the audience as well. And I just really need to get out every little thought in my brain I can decipher about it, or else I will never know peace. This video is more for me than it is for you. But you're so welcome to join me on this journey. So let's break the scene down. Let's take it step by step. Here's how it starts.
We will be out of this cavern in short order once they arrive with the mineral.
Now, just before Season 2 started, I was rewatching Season 1, and there was something I'd said about Tech that I was reminded of here. The point that I had made was that there's never really been a matter of Tech not caring. Tech just expresses caring differently than other characters. He really values facts, that is how he seems to process experiences, and that is how he cares. I'd even made a further point about how it's possible that facts are something of a comfort to him, because in uncertain times, it is logically a comfort to know what's real and tangible, whether it's good news or bad news. And naturally, he's driven to share that with the people he cares about. So in this scene, when he tells Omega that they are factually almost out of the situation because Hunter and Wrecker are bringing the Ipsium, I believe that this is him trying to comfort Omega in the way that makes the most sense to him. She doesn't have to be afraid because the objective facts are on their side, and it's likely that they're almost out of there. He's trying to make her feel better. Look at the way he sits right next to her. This is just his instinct about what he can offer that will be comforting. And it doesn't really help because Omega is working out of a very different place than he is. Facts aren't going to comfort her. She wants her emotions to be heard and validated. Tech still sticks with this tactic for a bit though, intending to comfort Omega by saying that they don't need help and that they'll always find a way out. Now that's what Tech says. I think what Omega hears is that Tech thinks they don't need Echo and Echo isn't important anymore, which is obviously not what he's saying, but I think that's what she hears. Which leads us to Omega finally articulating why she's been so upset with Tech. She doesn't feel like Tech cares about how much their lives keep changing, and she feels hurt by that because she cares so much.
Everything is changing, and you don't even care.
Right now, Omega feels like her world is falling apart. She lost Echo, now she lost her physical home, and the family she has left has been fighting all day when that's not very typical of them. She feels like there is no stability left for her to trust and like everything's crumbling down. This has a ton of weight because even though her life with the Marauder crew isn't necessarily a stable one, becoming a part of their family is probably the first time in her life where her needs are actually being met. Omega needs to be loved. She needs validation, and she needs people to assure her that she's valued. Having those needs finally met after a whole childhood of not having them met would make her latch really hard onto the squad. It's a serious blow for her to feel like her new world where she finally has a shot at getting everything she ever wanted is already falling apart, completely out of her control. So I would say that's where she's coming from. Now, I actually do want to talk specifically about the arguing among the team. I think that's the evidence of them also having difficulty adjusting to Echo's absence. It's the indirect expression of their feelings. I think it's harder for them to be in tune with how upset they may be over Echo leaving because they do understand why Echo left, and they're happy for him. They don't resent him. Unlike Omega, there isn't anything they're left asking why about. So I think it might be harder to understand how to express any hurt feelings, and I think that it's manifesting in really high interpersonal tension. With that being said, I find it interesting that Tech is the center of tension in this episode, and that he, whether he meant to or not, instigated most, if not all, of the interpersonal conflicts up to the point of opening up to Omega. And I don't mean that as a criticism of Tech. Of course, it wasn't fair to the rest of the team to be treated the way that they were, but I just mean to point out the fact that we were watching evidence of Tech carrying this pain with him for the whole episode. Anyway, back to the scene. Omega has just accused Tech of not caring, and his first reaction is one of surprise. It's a very quick reaction, so I'll slow it down so you can take a look. You can see his physical response of being taken aback by Omega's words. He would never dream of himself not caring. He knows exactly how much he cares, and he knows it's a lot. What's harder to know is how other people perceive his capacity to care, since it is more internal for him than it is external, and when it is external, it tends to look a little bit different than it might for other people. This is also a crucial moment, because this is exactly why Hunter sent Tech to talk to Omega. He sent him to check on her feelings and talk to her so that the tension in the group could be resolved and the group could become a safe space for processing Echo's departure. Tech surely entered this situation knowing that dealing with feelings in this way, whether it's his own or other people's, isn't necessarily the most natural thing for him. He may even be a little nervous. But Omega has just given him what he needs to know to move the conversation forward. She has very clearly expressed her thoughts. She has essentially given him the facts. Now it's his turn to do what he came to do and step up, and he does. Throughout the scene, we see him, on the one hand, struggling to put words to his experiences, and I think we're also seeing him be very thoughtful about what he says. I think he's gotten the sense that this is a crucial moment for him, for Omega, and for their relationship going forward, and he doesn't take that lightly. And as he starts to explain himself, he says,
I am not sure how I should care about change. It is a fundamental part of life.
And the delivery of that line is important because Tech said exactly what he means, and it's delivered with specificity to convey exactly what he means. D. Bradley Baker put emphasis on the word how, and it's an important detail in how this line is said. You can look at the phrase, "I'm not sure how I should care about change," and mistake it for meaning, "I'm not sure why I should care about change." And you can deliver that sentence in a way that communicates that. I'm not sure how I should care about change, right? But that's not what's being communicated here. By emphasizing the word how, it becomes clear that Tech's word choice is deliberate and true to his experience. I don't even think I can articulate this in the way that I want to. I'm trying to describe a feeling, and I can't quite find the right words, but he's saying that, like, he can't grasp onto, like, a method for caring about change. He means literally that he is not sure how he should go about caring about change. Should is also an important word here. He says, "I'm not sure how I should care about change." And that's important because it communicates the fact that the world outside of Tech has expectations for how he's supposed to respond to situations like this. And those expectations aren't really ones he can fulfill, as he's simply not wired that way. And I just want to, like, pop my head into the screen and be like, Tech, there is no how, there is no should, and you're doing fine. But anyway, this distinction may be subtle, but I think it's very important because with this subtext, Tech isn't invalidating Omega. He's just relaying his own personal experience. He's not saying, Omega, it's useless to care about change because it's inevitable. He's not saying that. He's saying something more like, I'm not wired in a way in which I respond to the situation the same way you do. It's a totally different message. But Omega needs to hear a little more before she understands. And she also hasn't quite aired out all of her frustration yet.
Echo left. Why doesn't that bother you?
Omega is clearly struggling with feelings of abandonment, which makes a lot of sense given her background and what the Marauder crew means to her. But she's really directing her feelings at Tech, because I think not understanding the fact that he does care is making her feel abandoned by him, in a sense. Omega wants validation. She wants to literally see others responding to the situation the same way as her, because then she'll feel less alone and like her feelings are valid. She's looking at the world through her own point of view, as everyone does, and the way that she experiences her feelings is naturally her main frame of reference for how to tell what others are feeling. It's kind of like her rule book, in a sense. She just needs her worldview expanded a little bit, and that'll happen by the end of the scene. One thing about Omega is that she has such a capacity for empathy and understanding, beyond her years really, so even though she's really upset right now, she'll be able to see beyond her own feelings in the end. And then Tech responds,
I am aware that you miss him, but we have to adapt and move on. That is what soldiers do.
We're really starting to see him pause to decide what to say at this point, which is not something we often see from him. You definitely get the sense that this is a more difficult situation for him to navigate, and you also get the sense that he's being very thoughtful and careful. He wants to say just the right thing, and he knows that it's important to say the right thing in a sensitive situation like this, but in a situation like this, it doesn't come as naturally to him. He's interacting with someone who works in a different way than he does, and it's hard for him to know what her rulebook is. You can see him being really careful and trying to both say what he thinks she might want to hear, the right thing to say, and also be honest about his thoughts at the same time. The first thing he does after he stops to think is validate Omega's feelings as best he can. I am aware you miss him. That part takes some thought because I think that's him trying to learn her rulebook and follow it even if it doesn't come naturally to him. And that's really hard. I appreciate that he makes the effort to do that for her. This is a sensitive situation and he's putting in the work to fulfill her needs. And hopefully his effort results in Omega putting in the work to understand him in return, and future interactions between them can be more natural. And I do think that that is the direction their relationship is left in by the end of the scene. The second part of that response is really interesting. Tech comes back to the idea of being a soldier. This isn't even the first time this season where we see how the war has a major influence on how Tech sees the world and how he fits into it. And that's not specific to Tech. This is a running theme with clones in general. Even though he never quite fit into the Grand Army of the Republic, even though he's pretty far removed from the military these days, he was bred to be a soldier. He was raised to think of himself as a mission-accomplishing machine for the Republic. And even with a deviant chip, there is still some level of that line of thought having been literally programmed into him. Now, of course, he doesn't have his chip anymore, but for pretty much his whole life, both nature and nurture were pushing this soldier identity on him. And that even comes through at a moment like this, when he is at his most open and honest, so you can really see how deeply it's ingrained in him. But Omega was not bred to be a soldier, so she responds with this.
We're more than that. We're a family. Aren't we?
To which Tech responds,
Well, yes. Yes, of course we are.
And this illustrates another difference between Omega and Tech. The idea of family is way at the forefront of Omega's mind because of her experiences, whereas for Tech, it seems more like something that he innately understands rather than something that's at the forefront of his mind or just something he can express as readily as Omega does. Also, I just love hearing that Tech does indeed view this unit as a family, despite them being brought up as a military squad. It's just so like, I'm melting. But Omega is still looking for answers and has one more clap back up her sleeve.
Then why don't you act like it?
And now Tech is really about to get into things. At this point, they give Tech a full 11 seconds of silence to take in what Omega has just said and navigate his next words. And I'm obsessed with that. A whole 11 seconds. That is so beautiful. That is not something you typically see in a show like this. An action-adventure 25-minute cartoon typically keeps things moving pretty fast, and even when it slows down, it's not typically like this. 11 seconds is a long time for an audience, in any medium, not just a 25-minute action-adventure cartoon. That is a pause that you really take note of. That's a pause that you feel. That is an amount of time where you know that silence has weight. And I love that this show is a 25-minute action-adventure cartoon that will allot 11 seconds of silence to a character so he can just stop and think. That is so beautiful. And it's also important for him specifically because it isn't easy for him to express himself in this way. It isn't easy for him to put his feelings to words like this, and he needs that time. And that time he got to think really paid off as we get some super resonant lines from him next.
Echo chose a different path, as did Crosshair. I have to respect their decision. Even though it can be difficult to understand, we must carry on.
Oh my god. This is unlike anything we've heard from Tech before. Like, we're finally being let in. I mean, even just listening to his voice, we've never heard anything like this from him before. You can hear the sadness in his voice when he brings up Crosshair in particular. You can hear the struggle in his voice when he says that he has to respect their decisions, even though it can be difficult to understand. And now it's clear as anything. All of these changes are indeed very hard for him. Change may even be something that is especially hard for him in particular and the way that his brain functions. And now we understand that it's been this hard for him the whole time. It's just not something we were let into before now. It's not something that we, the audience, were helped to understand yet. And it's something I had wondered about during season 1. What goes on in his head and his heart when he's grappling with serious emotions? I could see how he was processing the world in a more fact-based way than other characters, but I wanted to know what was happening inside him as a unique individual. I definitely didn't think that he was emotionless, and I also didn't think that he was repressing his emotions. I just really wanted to know what he personally did with his emotions. So basically, this is the scene that I've been waiting for this whole time. And now, you look back at that one line from the season 1 finale, and you see this right there. You know the line I'm talking about.
Crosshair has always been severe and unyielding. It is his nature. You cannot change that. He cannot change that. Why are you defending me? I am not. Understanding you does not mean that I agree with you.
And now we know exactly what we were seeing there. It wasn't just Tech being the objective and logical one. What we were seeing was Tech's coping mechanism. We were seeing his method for processing big emotions. Like, we were seeing the proof right there that he was in a lot of pain. That was an outward expression of his feelings. But the show hadn't yet clued us in on what to really look for to understand Tech, so we didn't quite grasp the full depth of what that moment was. And speaking of Crosshair, now back to the new episode, I want to point out that Tech brought up Crosshair when no one was talking about Crosshair. We see here that Echo leaving and Crosshair leaving are events that are inherently linked for him, and Crosshair is probably on his mind more than we will ever know. It's clear that that's a wound that still hurts, and it's been re-aggravated, and Tech is so not the person who is unfeeling and gets over things quickly. And on the one hand, I wish we got this insight sooner, but on the other hand, I think it's really impactful like this. We spent a lot of time with Tech in which he was being presented to us as Omega perceives him, because if anyone's our POV character in this show, it's Omega. So all this build-up is happening where we think we know who Tech is, and then boom, we find out who he really is. And the audience feels a similar impact to that of what Omega is feeling. The story in real life kind of parallel. I think this is a pretty impactful way to develop a character. This is not the first Star Wars character I have encountered who was developed like this, and I must say, those other characters who were developed like this There are very few other little men in Star Wars who have made me go quite that feral. So I say it hits. Anyway, back to the scene. Another thing that strikes me about what he's saying here is that it's so personal. He doesn't say, we must respect their decision. He says, I must respect their decision. He's not offering a solution about how to be objective or giving advice. He's walking Omega through his own personal internal process. And I feel like being this vulnerable and revealing thoughts that are this personal and finding the right way to word it all is probably really hard because, I don't know, it'd be pretty hard for me. I don't think it's easy for him or natural for him to get this personal with others, but I do think it's worthwhile, so kudos to you, Tech. There's one more line, and it is easily one of my favorite moments in the entire series thus far, and will likely remain such.
I may process moments and thoughts differently, but it does not mean that I feel any less than you.
I mean, really, wow. What really makes me like, about this line is it does not mean that I feel any less than you. Oh my god. Omega feels a lot. That is one of her main characteristics. She feels a lot. Now, Tech has been mistakenly perceived as someone who doesn't feel as much just because his outward expression of those feelings doesn't look the same as it does for others. So, for him to say that in reality, he does not feel less than Omega, that is super powerful. And a super powerful statement that transcends the show as well. With this line, with Tech saying that he processes moments and thoughts differently but doesn't feel any less, I would say it is now undeniable that Tech is being written as neurodivergent, which has been a headcanon that many fans have long accepted, but I don't think it's headcanon anymore. I don't think it's up for debate. I am not neurodivergent myself, but I think this is a really important message to send. There's such a stigma around people just for working differently, and it's the most horrible thing, and I think that this scene sends an important message about how it's important to make the effort to understand neurodivergent people, because you'd make the effort to understand anybody else, wouldn't you? And that neurodivergent people aren't broken, they just work differently, and it's so worthwhile to be understanding and discover the vast array of perspectives on life they have to offer. I love that the episode never asks Tech to change who he is. Even when change is asked of him, what's asked is that he reach out to Omega. There is never a narrative that presents who he is fundamentally as a problem, and in fact, the episode makes it a huge point to help Omega, and by extension, the neurotypical members of the audience, understand who Tech is fundamentally, so that we can see there's no need for him to be any different than who he is. And now, I don't want to decentralize this from being about neurodivergence, because that's, I think, pretty clearly what's being dealt with in this scene, but if I might, I would just like to maybe expand the lens a little bit. I did just want to say that this is resonating with me in a more general sense as well, just because sometimes it can feel like, in general, there's a stigma around having more indirect ways of expressing feelings or showing you care. Or maybe indirect isn't quite the right word. Well, I guess take Tech as an example. It's so clear that he cares for his family a great deal when you look at what he actually does. When Omega fell in the cavern, he jumped after her right away. An uncalculated risk, and he never takes those, but when it comes to Omega, there's no question. He homeschools Omega. Knowledge is one of the things that he values the most. It's so important to him, and he's passing that on to Omega. He built a chip scanner for the squad since the chips were a concern, and more! What is all of that if not a super clear indication that he cares so much? Words and, I don't know, like, the touchy-feely stuff, I guess, just isn't natural for everyone, and people have other ways of showing that they care, but a lot of times it can feel like that's viewed by society as a bad thing, or an indication that someone's emotionally repressed, or that something bad happened that had to make them that way, or that they're weird, or that they otherwise need to be fixed, or worst of all, that it's an indication that they don't care. This is always the person who's at the beginning of their character arc. Like, this is always the person that needs to change. But maybe they don't need to change. Maybe there should just be an effort to understand people and see all the ways they do show they care. It's so hard to play by a rulebook that isn't your own. Maybe the rulebook should be expanded. And I feel like that's the message this episode sent, which was so cool of them. It feels like it's really common for the person who's like Omega to get the sympathy and the understanding, which is so deserved and valid, and like, they should get sympathy and understanding. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this episode gave sympathy and understanding to both Omega and Tech, and I just think that's a really great thing. There isn't one way to care, there isn't one way to feel, there isn't one way to think, there isn't one way to process. And there's no right way for any of it. And I think that this episode quickly made itself something important to a lot of viewers by addressing that with sensitivity and sympathy. I loved the messages this scene sent. I loved watching Tech and Omega make a mutual effort to understand and be understood. And I'm really thankful to the cast and creative for making this. Gosh, that was a lot of talking for a 2-minute scene. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you got something out of it. Please give me your thoughts in the comments, please. And I'll talk to you guys later.